The morning Charles Thatcher rode into Caldwell, Kansas, the whole town held its breath, and Naomi Rourke was the only one who did not bother to stop sweeping her porch. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell sat close to the Kansas Indian Territory border like a town that had never quite decided if it wanted to be civilized or not. The cattle trails ran through its dirt streets like veins, pumping longhorns north from Texas, and with the cattle came the drovers, the gamblers, the men of questionable character, and occasionally a man whose reputation preceded him like a storm front rolling off the plains. Charles Thatcher was that kind of man. He owned the largest cattle operation in the Kaskaskia River Valley, a spread they called Thatcher Range, and it sprawled across so many acres that some people in Caldwell had never actually seen where it ended. He employed over 40 cowboys, owned 3 separate water rights that gave him effective control over who prospered and who dried up in the valley, and he had personally driven 2 neighboring ranchers into bankruptcy when they tried to encroach on what he considered his territory. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, and weathered in the way that men who spent their lives under an unforgiving sky became weathered. His jaw was square and set hard, his dark hair was shot through with early threads of silver at the temples, and his eyes were a shade of gray that people in town often described as the color of the sky just before a bad storm. He was not unkind in the way that purely cruel men are unkind. He was hard. There was a difference, and most people in Caldwell understood the distinction without being able to articulate it. The story most often told about Charles Thatcher was the one about Tom Briggs. Tom Briggs had been a smaller rancher who had diverted a creek that ran along the boundary of Thatcher Range, hoping to water his own herd through the dry season. Charles had ridden to Briggs's homestead at dawn with 2 of his men, not with guns drawn but with papers from a county judge confirming the water rights belonged to Thatcher. He had given Tom Briggs 3 days to restore the creek's natural course, and then he had left. Tom Briggs had not believed him. On the 4th day, Charles returned with a crew and redirected the water himself, and by the following season Tom Briggs's cattle were selling cheap because they were thin, and 2 seasons after that Tom Briggs was gone from the valley entirely. Nobody could say Charles Thatcher had broken a single law. That was what made people fear him more than any gunfighter. He did not need to be reckless. He was patient and he was thorough, and he always won. Naomi Rourke had arrived in Caldwell 14 months before that spring morning, which put her arrival in the bitter February of 1877. She had come from Independence, Missouri, following her father Patrick Rourke, who had scraped together enough money to buy a small plot on the edge of town and open a dry goods store. Patrick had believed with the conviction of a man who has nothing left to lose that Caldwell's boom would continue, that the cattle trade would keep flowing north, and that a well-run supply store would make him a comfortable living in his remaining years. He had been right about the cattle and wrong about having remaining years. Patrick Rourke had died of a fever in October of 1877, 5 months after his store had opened, leaving Naomi, age 26, with a modest inventory, a building she rented month to month from old Harvey Pell, and no one in the world who was obligated to look after her. She had a cousin back in Independence who had offered to take her in, and she had written back a polite but unmistakable refusal. Naomi Rourke was not the sort of woman who required taking in. She was not what anyone would call conventionally softened by her circumstances. She was of medium height with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned up with more practicality than vanity, and she had her Irish father's green eyes and her Missouri mother's stubborn jaw. She wore plain working dresses in serviceable blues and browns, kept her accounts in a ledger she balanced every single night before she slept, extended credit carefully and collected it without apology, and had told Sheriff Dale Prout, when he suggested she might want to consider selling the store and going back east, that she appreciated his concern and he could mind his own business. She had been in Caldwell for over a year, and she had, by the spring of 1878, established herself as a woman the town regarded with a mixture of respect and mild exasperation. She was fair in her dealings. She did not cheat. She stocked what people needed and did not inflate her prices simply because she could. But she also did not back down from a disagreement. She did not soften her opinions because someone bigger or louder was expressing theirs. And she had a particular quality that some people called nerve and others called stubbornness, which was that she looked you directly in the eye when she spoke to you, regardless of who you were. That was why, when Charles Thatcher rode past the front of Rourke's dry goods on that spring morning, and every other person on the main street of Caldwell found somewhere else to look, Naomi Rourke kept sweeping her porch and looked directly at him. He noticed. She could tell he noticed because his horse, a big roan gelding that moved with the same contained authority as its rider, slowed fractionally as it passed her. Charles Thatcher's storm-gray eyes moved to her face, and she held his gaze without the smile that women used to make difficult moments easier, and without the downward glance that passed for deference. He did not speak. He rode on. Naomi went back to sweeping. She thought about it afterward, standing behind her counter and organizing a new shipment of flour sacks, and she decided she had not done anything particularly brave. She had simply not manufactured a reason to be afraid of a man she had never spoken to, and she considered that to be a basic practice of good sense. She was wrong to think it would not have consequences. 3 days later, Charles Thatcher walked into Rourke's dry goods. He came alone, which surprised her, because she had heard that he usually moved through town with at least one of his hands nearby. The bell above the door announced him, and Naomi looked up from the bolt of calico she was measuring and cutting for Edna Walsh, who needed fabric for a quilt. She recognized him immediately. Even if she had not seen him 3 days prior, she would have recognized the particular quality of space he took up when he entered a room. He was a large man, but it was not only size. It was the way he moved, carefully and deliberately, like a man accustomed to being watched. "Mrs. Walsh," Naomi said, without missing a beat, "I'll be finished with your order in just a moment." Edna Walsh, who had gone the color of unbleached linen the moment Charles Thatcher stepped through the door, made a small sound of agreement and fixed her eyes on the fabric in Naomi's hands. Charles moved to the counter and waited. He did not tap his fingers or shift his weight or do any of the things that impatient men do. He simply stood. Naomi finished measuring the calico, cut it cleanly, folded it, and wrapped it in brown paper for Edna. She quoted the price. Edna paid with hands that trembled only slightly, collected her parcel, murmured something in the direction of Charles Thatcher's boots, and departed with considerable speed. Naomi placed the coins in her till and looked at Charles Thatcher. "What can I help you with?" she asked. He put both hands on the counter, leaning slightly, and studied her the way a man studies a puzzle he has not decided is worth solving. "You're Rourke's daughter." "I am Naomi Rourke," she said. "Rourke's Dry Goods is my store. What can I help you with?" The slight emphasis on my store was deliberate, and something in his expression shifted, though she could not have said whether it was amusement or annoyance. "I need to speak with you about your back property line," he said. That surprised her. She had expected him to want to purchase something or to have some complaint that she had not yet heard about. Not this. "My back property line," she repeated. "Harvey Pell," he said, "is selling the building you rent from him. I am the party he has agreed to sell it to." Naomi felt a cold clarity settle over her that she recognized as the opposite of panic. She breathed through it, held his gaze, and said, "I have a lease." "I know." "Then you know that any sale of the property does not alter the terms of my existing lease." Something moved through his eyes, swift and unreadable. "I am aware of that as well." "Then I am not sure what requires discussion," she said. "If you buy this building, you become my landlord. My lease runs through December. My rent is paid monthly and it is always on time. I cannot imagine this presents a problem." He straightened from the counter. He was taller when he was fully upright, and she was aware of it the way you are aware of the ceiling being higher in one room than another. It simply was a fact of space. I intend to expand the building, he said, and potentially alter its use. After December, she said. When my lease is up, you may do with it as you please. He looked at her steadily. Most people in this situation would ask me what I plan to do or express some concern. Most people in this situation, Naomi said, have not read the terms of their lease carefully enough to know they have nothing to worry about until December. I have read mine. There was a pause, long enough that the clock on the wall marked 3 seconds of it. Then Charles Thatcher said, "You are not from Caldwell." "No," she said. "Independence, Missouri. Is there anything else I can help you with?" He shook his head once and turned toward the door. He was halfway there when he stopped and looked back over his shoulder, and she was still watching him, which she could tell had not been his expectation. "You watched me ride past 3 days ago," he said, without looking away. "I was on my porch," she said. "I was looking at the street. You rode down the street. No one else looked. That is their business," she said, "and this is mine. Good morning, Mr. Thatcher." He held her gaze for one more moment, then opened the door, and the bell rang his departure. Naomi released a breath she had not entirely been holding. She pulled out her ledger and opened it to the rent entries, and stared at the numbers without seeing them, and thought about what it meant that Charles Thatcher was buying her building. She thought about it with the same methodical care she applied to everything, and she arrived at a practical conclusion, which was that she needed to start saving more aggressively in case she had to find a new location in December. She also made a note to review her lease with fresh eyes that evening. She did not think about the way he had looked at her when he realized she had watched him ride past. She told herself she did not think about it. She was moderately successful. News traveled in Caldwell the way water travels through dry ground, quickly, and in directions you did not always anticipate. By that same afternoon, 3 people had mentioned to Naomi, in varying degrees of delicacy, that Charles Thatcher had been seen entering her store. Old Doc Hennessy asked her if everything was all right. The woman who ran the boarding house, Clara Sims, stopped by on the pretense of needing lamp oil and asked the same question with considerably more elaborate indirection. The most direct inquiry came from Bill Marsh, who ran the feed store 2 buildings down and considered himself a practical man. "You want to tell me what Thatcher wanted?" he asked her, standing at her counter with his hat in his hands. "He came in to speak with me about the property," she said. "He is buying the building from Harvey Pell." Bill Marsh looked grave in the way that men who already knew the news they are delivering look grave. "That's not good for you, Naomi." "My lease is solid through December," she said. "Thatcher doesn't always." Bill stopped, tried again. "He has a way of making things inconvenient for people who don't cooperate." "I haven't been uncooperative," she said. "I've been clear about my position, which is legal and documented." "Being right and being safe are 2 different things." Naomi looked at him steadily. "I know that, Bill. I have known that my entire life. But I will not vacate a perfectly good lease because someone powerful wants me to, and I will not conduct my business any differently because Charles Thatcher has invested in the building around it. If he wants to be my landlord, he can be my landlord." Bill Marsh put his hat back on his head with the look of a man who had done his Christian duty and now absolved himself of the consequences. "You're a stubborn woman, Naomi Rourke." "Thank you," she said. He left shaking his head. The following week, Harvey Pell came to finalize the sale, and he had the decency to come to her in person and tell her he was sorry for the disruption. Harvey was a small, dried-out man in his 60s who had been in Caldwell since before it had proper streets, and he looked genuinely conflicted. "Thatcher made me an offer I couldn't say no to," Harvey said. "My daughter needs the money for her situation in Wichita, and truth is this building has been more trouble to maintain than I can manage." "Harvey," she said, "I do not blame you. You are entitled to sell your property. Just make sure the deed transfer is properly recorded, because when it is, I intend to provide the new owner with written confirmation of my lease terms." Harvey Pell looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between admiration and bewilderment. "Naomi, you know most women would. I know what most women would do," she said pleasantly. I am Naomi Rourke. It was nice doing business with you, Harvey." He left with his hat twisted in his hands and what appeared to be a slight smile behind his mustache. The deed transferred on a Friday. On Monday morning, a letter arrived at Rourke's Dry Goods, delivered by one of Thatcher's cowboys, a young man named Pete Dawson, who had the particular discomfort of a person carrying something he did not fully understand the contents of. The letter was brief, clearly written by Charles Thatcher himself rather than dictated, because the handwriting was clean and direct without the ornamental loops that hired correspondents tended to carry. It said that as the new owner of the property, he acknowledged the existing lease and its terms, that he expected rent to continue on the same schedule, and that he wished to meet with her at his earliest mutual convenience to discuss the practical matters of building maintenance during the remainder of her lease. It also said, at the end, in a sentence she read twice, "I intend to be a fair landlord to an apparently capable tenant." She wrote back in return, through Pete Dawson, who waited with growing discomfort while she penned it, that she appreciated the acknowledgement and that she was available on Wednesday mornings before 10 o'clock, as that was when her deliveries arrived and the store was at its least occupied. He came Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock. She had expected him to bring someone, a lawyer or a ranch hand or some practical intermediary, but he came alone again, and she found she preferred this, because a man who comes alone to handle his own business is a man you can speak to plainly. He had papers with him, a copy of the lease with his own notes in the margins, and they sat at the small table she kept near the back of the store for exactly the purpose of having practical conversations without standing awkwardly at the counter. She poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot she kept on the small cast iron stove, and she did not ask him if he wanted one. She simply put it in front of him. He looked at the coffee cup, and then at her, and something in his expression changed in a way she could not quite categorize. They went through the lease term by term. He had questions about the storage arrangement at the back of the building, and she explained which shelving was hers and which had come with the property. He noted that the roof over the storeroom had a soft spot that would need attention before winter, and offered to have his carpenter look at it. She said she would appreciate that, as long as any work was scheduled when it would not disrupt business. He agreed. He noted that the previous owner had allowed her use of a small fenced yard at the back, which was not explicitly mentioned in the lease. "I use it for receiving large deliveries," she said. "Flour barrels, that sort of thing. I can show you." They went through the back and she showed him the yard, the loading arrangement, the practical geography of how her supply chain worked. He listened without interrupting, which was more than many men managed. Standing in the backyard in the spring morning light with the sounds of Caldwell's commerce coming over the fence in pieces, he said, "How long have you been running this alone?" She glanced at him. "Since October, when my father died." "I heard about that," he said. "I'm sorry." The sincerity in it was plain. Not elaborated upon, not dressed up, just there, stated plainly, the way a man states the weather. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. "Why did you stay?" he asked. She looked at him directly. "Because this is my store and this is my livelihood and I am capable of managing it." "That's not what I meant," he said. "I meant why did you stay in Caldwell, a woman alone? It's not easy." "Nothing worth doing is easy," she said. "I presume you know that, given how long you have been building your operation in this valley." He went quiet again. That particular quality of quiet that she was beginning to understand was not absence of thought but the opposite of it. "Fair point," he said. They went back inside and finished the practical discussion. When he stood to leave, he picked up his hat from the table and held it for a moment, turning it in his hands the way men do when they have more to say than they intend to. "The roof will be attended to within the month," he said. "I'll send word before the carpenter comes." "Thank you," she said. He nodded, and she walked him to the front door, and he stepped out into the bright morning, and she watched him mount his horse at the rail, and he looked back at her once through the window before he rode north toward the edge of town. She thought it was probably the most civil property discussion she had ever had. She thought about it more than she should have over the following days. The carpenter came as promised, a weathered man named Gus who was quick and competent and had the roof over the storeroom properly shored up within 2 days. He was cheerful company and did not interfere with her business, and when he finished, she offered him coffee and a fair wage for the additional work he had done on the loading door that had been sticking, and he accepted both with genuine appreciation. "Mr. Thatcher told me to do right by you," Gus said, pulling on his jacket to leave. "Did he?" she said. "Not a question exactly. Said you were a good tenant and to treat the property with respect." Gus grinned. First time I heard him use the word respect in that particular way. Usually when he talks about property, it's more about rights. She thought about that. The first real trouble came in late May. A man named Vernon Drury had been making his way through the cattle towns along the trail, passing bad currency and buying goods with it before moving on. He had hit 2 stores in Wichita and 1 in Abilene, and word had come down the wire to Sheriff Prout that he was heading south again. Naomi had heard this from Bill Marsh, who heard everything, and she had taken to examining bills carefully for several days. Vernon Drury came into her store on a Tuesday afternoon with the relaxed manner of a man who had done this successfully enough times to feel confident about it. He was sandy-haired and pleasant-looking in the unremarkable way that people who deceive for a living often are. He bought a considerable quantity of goods, a knife, a length of rope, tin goods, and tobacco, and when he paid, she looked at the bills carefully enough that he shifted his weight and smiled the practiced smile. She put the bills on the counter between them and said, "These are counterfeit." He blinked. "Ma'am, I don't know what they are counterfeit," she said again. "The printing on the portrait is blurred on the left side and the paper is wrong. I'm not going to accept them. If you have real money, I'm happy to sell you these goods. If you do not, I would suggest you leave my store immediately, because Sheriff Prout's office is across the street, and I will be speaking with him shortly either way." Vernon Drury's pleasant expression dissolved into something harder, and he looked at her with the assessing gaze of a man deciding how much of a problem she represented. He apparently decided she was a significant one, because he swept the counterfeit bills off the counter, grabbed only the tobacco, which she had not yet bagged, and walked out the door with it. She let the tobacco go. She went directly across the street to Sheriff Prout. Prout caught Vernon Drury at the north end of town within the hour, with the tobacco, the counterfeit bills, and enough additional false currency to constitute a federal offense. He was arrested and held for the federal marshal. What Naomi did not entirely anticipate was that this story would travel the way stories travel in Caldwell, fast and with elaboration. By the next day, the version being told in the saloon apparently involved her holding a shotgun, which was entirely fictional. By the day after, she had heard 3 different second-hand accounts of the incident that bore only passing resemblance to what had actually happened. What she did not anticipate even more than the elaboration was that Charles Thatcher would walk into her store on Thursday morning, look at her with those steady gray eyes, and say, "I heard you caught a counterfeiter." "I identified counterfeit bills," she said. "The sheriff caught him. You told him to leave or you'd report him." "Yes, alone," he said, "in the store." "You told a man running counterfeit currency that you were going to report him." "He was in my store with bad money," she said. "What would you have preferred I do? Accept the currency and stay quiet?" Charles Thatcher looked at her for a long moment. "Most people would have simply told him they didn't have the right change and let him leave. And then he would have moved to the next store," she said, "and the one after that, and those would have been my neighbor's losses." He was quiet. Then he said something she had not expected. "You are either very brave or very foolish, Mr. Thatcher," she said. "I have been managing this store alone through a winter that saw the price of flour double and a spring where my main supplier changed his routing, and I had to find a new one. And I have kept my accounts in the black and my customers supplied. I assure you I have calculated my risks very carefully." He looked at her the way he had looked at her that first morning through the window on his horse, like she was something the landscape had produced that he had not seen before and was not entirely sure what to make of. Then he said, "Do you need anything for the store?" It was such a complete change of subject that she almost laughed. She did not, but it was a closer thing than she would have admitted. "I need a new shipment of lamp oil," she said. "My supplier is 2 weeks behind." "I have a freight contact in Wichita who is reliable," he said. "I can give you the name." "I would appreciate that," she said. He gave her the name and the contact's usual terms from memory, which told her he was a man who kept track of practical information as a habit rather than a performance. She wrote it down in her ledger. He bought a pair of leather-work gloves before he left. He paid with real money, 2 coins, and examined them once without thinking before he placed them on the counter, which made her hide another almost smile behind her professional expression. "Good day, Mr. Thatcher," she said. "Good day, Miss Rourke," he said, and she noted the Miss instead of Mrs., which meant someone had told him her story more carefully than just the store's ownership. He was halfway through the door when she said, "The gloves are a good choice. The left thumb on the pair you wore in here last time had a split." He stopped, looked down at his hands, then at her. "You noticed that?" "I sell work gloves," she said. "I notice these things." He left with what she was almost certain was the beginning of a smile. Summer in Caldwell was a particular kind of relentless. The cattle drives brought a constant current of humanity through town, and the main street pulsed with an energy that was part commerce and part contained chaos. The drovers spent their pay with the enthusiasm of men who had been on the trail for months, and the town accommodated them with the efficient industry of a place that understood its own economy. Naomi did well in the summer. The drive traffic needed supplies, and she was fair and well-stocked. She hired a girl, Sarah Beekman, who was 17 and the youngest daughter of a farming family east of town, to help with the counter during the peak weeks, and Sarah proved to be quick-handed and good with figures. Naomi taught her the accounts with the same methodical patience her father had used to teach her, and Sarah learned faster than most. Charles Thatcher came into the store 4 more times between June and August, and each time it was for something practical. Rope, once. A particular type of lock mechanism she had to order for him, which arrived promptly because she used his Wichita freight contact, who was indeed reliable. Coffee once, which surprised her because she assumed a ranch the size of his had all of that organized in bulk. When she said as much, he told her he wanted a specific variety that his cook had mentioned, and he had simply been in the area. She sold him 2 pounds and did not point out that Thatcher Range was not particularly close to town. Their conversations were efficient and courteous and increasingly not purely about commerce. He asked about her father once, and she told him about Patrick Rourke with the measured candor of someone who had processed a grief enough to speak about it clearly. Patrick had been a man full of optimistic ideas that rarely produced the results he expected, but full also of a warmth that made the failures bearable. He had believed in Caldwell because he had needed to believe in something. "He sounds like a man who led with hope," Charles said. "He did," she said. "It was his greatest strength and also what made certain things very difficult." Charles said, "My father led with force. I used to think that was better. Now I'm not certain." It was more personal than anything he had said before, and she could tell it surprised him slightly to have said it. She did not make much of it. She simply let it be there in the room, which seemed to be what he needed. He asked about Missouri. She asked about how he had built the ranch, and he told her briefly and without embellishment, as if the facts alone were sufficient, which they were. He had come to Kansas in 1868 with money from selling his father's Virginia property after the war, and he had bought the first parcel of what would become Thatcher Range at 24 years old. He had built slowly and carefully and had made decisions that other men called ruthless and he called thorough. "The Briggs situation," she said once, and immediately regretted it because it was more direct than their conversations had been. He looked at her steadily. "What about it? People say you drove him out of the valley." "I held a legal water right that he was violating," Charles said. "I gave him time to comply voluntarily. He didn't. I enforced the right." He lost his ranch. He made choices that put him in a position where his margins were thin enough that a dry season could collapse him. I did not create his financial situation. I enforced my legal position. She looked at him. That is technically true. But, he said, but a man with the kind of leverage you had could have chosen to handle it differently, she said. You could have negotiated a shared use agreement. His cattle were dying. There was a silence, long enough that she wondered if she had gone further than their cautious and growing friendship permitted. It was July, warm enough that the back of the store was slightly humid, and the sound of Caldwell's summer afternoon was coming through the open front door. Then Charles said, "You're right." She did not expect that. She looked at him directly. "I was 29, he said. I had worked for 6 years to secure that range, and someone was taking from it without asking. I reacted to that, and I was thorough about it, the way I am thorough about everything, without considering whether thoroughness was actually what the situation required." He paused. "Tom Briggs and his family have a farm now near Wellington. They are not destitute. I am told his son is doing well." "How would you be told that?" she said. "Because I made inquiries," he said. 2 years ago, she absorbed this. "That is not nothing." "No," he said, "it is not enough, but it is not nothing." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You are more complicated than your reputation suggests, Mr. Thatcher." "Most people are," he said. "You more than most." It was the closest he had come to a compliment, and it landed with more weight than an elaborately phrased one would have. The conversation she thought about most that summer was not the one about Tom Briggs. It was a shorter one that happened on an afternoon in August when a storm was building to the west, and the light had gone that particular greenish-yellow that meant the weather was serious. She was closing up early, pulling the shutters on the front window, and he came around the corner of the building from the back, because he had apparently been looking at the roof that his carpenter had repaired in the spring. She startled slightly, which she did not often do, and he stopped immediately and said, "I apologize. I should have come to the front." "It is all right," she said. "Is there a problem with the roof?" "No," he said. "I like to check things. I check what I own." "The building," she said. "Of course." There was something in the way he looked at her when she said that, something swift and complicated, and then he said, "Is everything secure for the storm?" "I know how to prepare for weather," she said. "I know you do," he said, not defensively, just as a statement. "I wanted to make sure the roof repair would hold. It will. Gus does good work." The first serious gust of wind came then, pulling at her hair and sending dust spiraling up from the street. She put her hand up to hold the shutter, and he stepped forward without thinking and caught the other side of it. And for a moment they were both holding the same shutter in the rising wind, close enough that she could smell the outdoor smell of him, leather and dust and something that was just the particular warmth of a person. She fastened the shutter. He stepped back. "Thank you," she said. "Of course," he said, and he helped her with the remaining shutters without being asked and without making anything of it. And when she had locked the front door, he walked with her to the boarding house where she rented a room, because the rain started and he had a hat and she did not. He did not offer her his hat or any chivalric gesture. He simply walked beside her, and she was sheltered somewhat by his size against the first stinging drops, and she was aware of this and said nothing about it, because sometimes you simply accept the shelter that is offered. At the door of the boarding house, Clara Sims appeared in the window with an expression of considerable speculation, which Naomi resolved to address later. She turned to Charles and said, "This was very decent of you." "You would have managed," he said. It was not said dismissively. It was said as a recognition. "I would have," she agreed. He nodded, touched the brim of his hat, and walked back into the rain. Clara Sims had approximately 47 questions. Naomi answered none of them and went to her room and sat in the window, watching the storm move through. And she was honest with herself in the way that she was honest with everyone, which was directly and without comfort. She was beginning to care about Charles Thatcher in a way that was distinct from the practical regard she had for a landlord and an occasional customer, and a source of useful contacts. She was beginning to care about him in the way that notices a person's hands and the precise quality of their silence, and the specific weight of what they say when they finally choose to say something true. This was complicated, and she knew it was complicated, and she sat with the complication the way she sat with difficult account figures. She examined it from multiple directions. He was a man of significant power in this valley. He was her landlord. His reputation was formidable and not entirely unearned. He was also, she thought, a man who had made inquiries about Tom Briggs 2 years after driving him out, which was a thing that mattered. He was a man who checked his roofs. He was a man who told you plainly when you were right. She looked at the storm moving east across the plains and thought about December, when her lease would end, and she would either renew or leave. And she thought about the fact that both of those possibilities felt different than they had in May. In September, a situation developed that moved things forward in the way that situations in the Wild West tended to move things, which was quickly and without ceremony. A cattle drive crew came through Caldwell in the second week of September, later than the main season, trailing about 800 longhorns from South Texas. They were under the management of a trail boss named Cal Harding, who was competent and weathered, and who had been on the trail long enough to have the particular frayed quality of a man who has been managing other men in difficult conditions for months. Most of the crew was orderly. 2 of them were not. A pair of drovers named Burl and Eddie, who were apparently cousins, and apparently believed that the end of a long drive entitled them to exceptional latitude in their behavior, caused a succession of problems in Caldwell over 3 days. They were loud in the saloon, disruptive in the street, and on the 3rd day, Eddie walked into Naomi's store and began picking up items without paying for them, pocketing small goods with the casual arrogance of a man who did not expect to be stopped. Naomi had been watching him from the moment he walked in. Sarah Beekman was at the counter, and Naomi came from the back of the store and said, directly and clearly, "Put those back and pay for what you want or get out." Eddie, who was broad-shouldered and not entirely sober at 2 in the afternoon, turned and looked at her with the particular surprise of a man who has never been addressed that way by a woman in his life. "And who is going to make me?" he said. "If I have to make you," she said, "it will involve Sheriff Pruitt and a federal complaint about theft, and since you are from out of state, that will be a federal matter that will follow you back to Texas. But if you simply put the items down and leave, none of that has to happen." Eddie stared at her. Sarah Beekman had gone very still behind the counter. Then the door opened and Pete Dawson walked in, which was coincidental and fortunate. Pete Dawson was one of Thatcher's cowboys, a young man who was tall and lean, and who wore his Colt on his hip with the comfort of long practice. He had come in for work gloves and a spool of wire, and he looked at the scene and understood it within 2 seconds. "Eddie," he said, in a voice that was casual and conversational and somehow entirely clear, "I believe you came in here to buy something." Eddie looked at Pete Dawson, and then at the Colt, and then back at Naomi, and his assessment of the situation evidently shifted. He put the items in his pockets on the counter, not gently, but he put them down. He bought nothing. He left. Pete Dawson bought his gloves and his wire, paid, and said to Naomi, "You all right?" "I am fine," she said. "Thank you for the timing." "Yes, ma'am," Pete said, and went out, and Naomi could tell from his expression that this story was going to be at the bunkhouse at Thatcher Range before sundown. She was right. Charles appeared the following morning. "Pete told me about yesterday," he said. "It was handled," she said. "It was," he said. "But I want you to know," he stopped. Tried again with the precision of a man choosing words he is not entirely accustomed to choosing. "I want you to know that if something like that happens and you need someone, you can send word to me." She looked at him. "Why?" It was a direct question, not an unkind one, but a real one. He held her gaze. "Because you are a person under my roof and in my valley, and that means something to me." "In your valley," she said quietly, not challenging, not quite. "I know how that sounds," he said. "I know I have a particular way of thinking about this valley and my position in it. I have been told." "You are in fact the most feared rancher in this valley," she said. He looked at her. "Yes. But you are also the one standing in my store at 8 in the morning to make sure I am all right," she said. Something shifted in his expression, something that was usually very carefully contained, and he said, "Yes, I am." She had the feeling then, looking at him in the morning light that came through the window she had just unshuttered for the day, that they were standing at a particular edge of something, the way you stand at the edge of a drop and know clearly that you are going to step off it, and that the stepping is entirely a matter of when rather than if. She said, "Would you like coffee?" He said, "Yes." He sat at the small table in the back of the store, and she brought coffee, and they talked for an hour. Not about the store, not about the lease, not about the roof or the freight contact or the practical geography of their relationship. They talked about books, which surprised her, because she had not known he read, and it surprised her further when she found he had read more broadly than she had. He had a library at Thatcher Range, 3 walls of it in a room he used as his study, and when she expressed genuine interest, he described the collection with the same quiet thoroughness he brought to everything. She told him about the books she had carried from Missouri, 4 of them, which was all she had been able to transport, and the particular calculation of which 4 to choose from her father's modest collection. She had chosen practical reference, a medical guide, an agricultural manual, and then 2 novels, which she had chosen by holding them and standing in the empty Independence House and deciding that she needed 2 things that were not practical. Which novels? He asked. She told him. He had read both. They argued, gently and with unexpected energy, about the ending of one of them, and she found herself leaning forward over the table making a point about character motivation, with the focused pleasure of a person who has not had this particular kind of conversation in too long. He was smiling when she finished. Not the beginning of one, a full one, and it changed his face in a way that she held carefully in her attention. "You are passionate about that ending," he said. "I have strong feelings about when authors take the easy path," she said. "I have noticed," he said, "that you have strong feelings about when anyone takes the easy path." She sat back. "Is that a criticism?" "No," he said. "It is one of the things He stopped again, and this time the pause was longer. "It is one of the things I find most." He was looking at her with those gray eyes, and the word he landed on was, "worth knowing." The air in the store was very still. "Charles," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both heard it. "Naomi," he said in the same register, and that was the first time too. The bell above the door announced a customer, and they both moved, the spell breaking cleanly and not unkindly, and she went to the counter, and he gathered himself and finished his coffee, and he was leaving just as the customer, Edna Walsh again with her reliable timing, came fully through the door. Edna Walsh looked between the two of them with an expression that suggested she was storing this information for extensive later analysis. "Good morning, Charles," she said. "Good morning, Edna," he said, and touched his hat brim and went out. Edna Walsh looked at Naomi for a long, deliberate moment. "Good morning, Edna," Naomi said. "What can I help you with today?" Edna bought 6 yards of muslin, which she did not need, and left happy. October in Caldwell carried the particular weight of a season that knows it is ending. The last cattle drives moved through, and the drovers with them, and the town settled into a calmer rhythm that felt like exhaling after months of held breath. The prairie went golden, and the nights came earlier, and the air had that clean, sharp quality that Naomi had come to associate with Kansas specifically, a dryness that made everything smell precise. She had been in Caldwell for almost 2 years now, and she had made it, which was the thing she had needed most to prove. She had made it through the first winter alone, through the early spring doubt, through the summer heat and the trouble and the building sale that had looked threatening and turned into something else entirely. Her lease was up at the end of December. She had known for weeks what she was going to do about it. She had not said so to anyone. She had written to her freight contact in Wichita about the possibility of an expanded arrangement for the following year, which was a thing you only do if you are planning to be in business the following year in the same place. What she had not resolved was the other thing that was sitting in her chest like a question she had not yet found the words for. Charles came into the store in mid-October on a morning when the first real suggestion of winter was in the air, and he brought with him the particular focused quality he had when he had decided to do something specific. He had a copy of a lease renewal document with him. He put it on the counter and looked at her. "I had this drawn up," he said. "A 2-year renewal, same rent as your current lease." She looked at the document and then at him. The same rate," he said. "The market rate for commercial property has gone up since my father signed the original agreement," she said. "You are entitled to adjust it." "I know I'm entitled," he said. "I chose not to." She was very still for a moment. Then she said, "Why?" He had been waiting for that question. She could tell he had been waiting for it. He put both hands flat on the counter in the gesture she had come to know as the thing he did when he was about to say something he had thought about carefully. "Because you have been one of the best things in this town for the past year," he said. "Because you are fair and you are honest and you did not back down from me when I walked in here with a property deed, which is something no one else in this valley has done in a long time." She held his gaze. "Because," he said, and his voice was lower and more plain, "I would like you to stay, not only as a tenant." The store was very quiet. The October wind moved past the window. "You would like me to stay," she said. "I would like you to stay," he said, "and I would like you to consider whether you would allow me to call on you properly. As a man who has a great deal of respect for you, and has been trying to find the right way to say this for about 4 months. Naomi Rourke looked at Charles Thatcher, and she thought about every conversation they had had since May, every cup of coffee, every deliberate, careful, honest exchange, every moment of his unexpected self-correction and her forthright pushback, and the particular quality of a relationship that had been built on the unusual foundation of two people who did not pretend to be anything other than exactly what they were. She thought about Tom Briggs and the inquiries made 2 years later. She thought about a man who checked his roofs and remembered the details of his freight contacts and had 3 walls of books in his study. She thought about a man standing in the rain holding a shutter. "Charles," she said. "Naomi," he said. "Sign the lease," she said, "and come back Sunday afternoon. I will have coffee ready and no customers." He signed the lease. His handwriting was clean and direct, the same as his letter. He came back Sunday afternoon. The months that followed were the most particular kind of courtship that the frontier permitted, which was one conducted in plain sight of a small town with strong opinions, over coffee and conversation, and the occasional shared meal, moving slowly and with the deliberate care of two people who had both, for different reasons, learned not to move quickly toward things they valued. He brought her books from his library, carried in saddlebags with a care that she found quietly touching. She returned them with her marginal notes penciled lightly in them, and he read her notes before he shelved them, and sometimes he disagreed, and he would tell her so the next visit, and they would have those conversations with the particular pleasure of people who are well matched in argument. He showed her Thatcher Range in November, riding out on a Saturday when Sarah Beekman minded the store with competent independence. She had expected to be impressed by the scale, and she was, but she had not expected to be moved by the smaller details. The kitchen garden, carefully maintained even in late season by his cook, a Mexican woman named Luz who had been with the ranch since the beginning. The foaling barn with its particular smell of hay and warmth. The library, which was everything he had described and arranged with the organization of a man who used the books rather than collected them. She ran her hand along a shelf and pulled out a volume she recognized, and he watched her do it with an expression she had no trouble reading by then. She looked up at him. "You have loved this room," she said. "Yes," he said. "It was the first room I built properly when I had the money to build things properly. The house itself took years to expand, but this room I built correctly from the start." "Why this one first?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I needed something in this house that was for thinking rather than for doing. Everything I built in those early years was for doing, working, managing, planning. This was the first room I built for something else. For thinking," she said. "And eventually," he said, looking at her with the calm steadiness that was his particular quality, for someone to share the thinking with. She put the book back carefully and turned fully to face him, and the morning light came through the window of that room, and she said, "Charles." "Yes," he said before she said anything else, which was somehow exactly right. He kissed her once, gently and with great restraint, in the library of Thatcher Range, and she allowed it and returned it, and they both stood in the aftermath of it with the kind of quiet that is not absence but fullness. "I am not a woman who will simply go along with things," she said, which under the circumstances was perhaps the most unnecessary statement she had ever made. "I know," he said. "I am counting on that." He proposed in December, on the day her original lease expired, which she later teased him about as either deeply romantic or extremely businesslike, and he accepted the teasing without defensiveness, because he had the capacity she had not initially expected to accept being teased, which she considered one of his finest qualities. He proposed in her store, at the small table where they had drunk so much coffee over the past months, with no ring because he had not wanted to assume her tastes, and she told him she preferred to choose her own, which he agreed to immediately and without any appearance of surprise. She said yes, and they shook hands first, which made them both laugh, a real laugh, the kind that comes from genuine ease rather than performance, and then he stood and came around the table and she stood too, and he held her face in his hands the way you hold something you have not yet grown entirely accustomed to the privilege of holding, and kissed her properly. Clara Sims saw it through the window. By morning, all of Caldwell knew. Sheriff Dale Prout came to congratulate her, and had the grace to look slightly sheepish about his earlier suggestion that she sell the store and go back east. She forgave him graciously. Bill Marsh from the feed store wrung her hand and told her she was the most surprising woman he had ever met in 20 years of Caldwell commerce. Edna Walsh cried, which nobody had quite expected. They were married in March of 1879, in the small church at the north end of Caldwell on a morning when the plains were just turning green again at their edges, the ceremony conducted by the Reverend Thomas Hull, who had married 6 couples the previous year, and still managed to look as though this particular one moved him. Luz had come from Thatcher Range and stood in the front row and wept openly, and considered this not at all embarrassing. Pete Dawson stood as a witness, which made him stand very straight with the gravity of someone who understands the weight of what they have been asked to do. Naomi wore a dress she had made herself, a deep blue wool, because it was still March on the Kansas plains, and the morning had a cold edge to it, and she had chosen the color with the deliberate intention of someone who has thought about what she wants to look like on the most important morning of her adult life. She had flowers from somewhere, small early prairie flowers that Clara Sims had found and arranged with more skill than anyone had expected. Charles wore his best suit, which was dark and well cut, and had clearly not seen the inside of a saddlebag. He had shaved very carefully. When he saw her walk down the short aisle of that church, his expression did something that the people who knew his reputation would have found entirely inconsistent with it, which was that it became very open and very simple, like a landscape when the weather finally clears. He said his vows in a voice that was clear and steady and meant every word. She said hers the same way. Reverend Hull pronounced them husband and wife, and Charles kissed her in a manner that was restrained by frontier church standards, but was deeply, entirely sincere, and the small gathering applauded with the particular warmth of people who have watched something they were not sure was possible become real. The first year of their marriage was a revolution in the quietest possible sense. Naomi moved into Thatcher Range, which was larger than any house she had lived in, and which she approached with the same methodical practicality she applied to everything. She had kept the store because she had discussed this with Charles before the wedding and he had agreed without reservation, and the agreement had not required argument, only the clear statement of her position and his consideration of it. He had said, "The store is yours. It has always been yours. Of course you keep it." She had said, "Some men would feel differently." He had said, "Some men would be wrong." She had managed, over the winter months before the wedding, to successfully negotiate a permanent purchase of the building from Charles at a fair price, which he had accepted, and which made her the owner rather than the tenant, which was a distinction she cared about deeply, and which he understood she cared about deeply and respected accordingly. She continued to run the store with Sarah Beekman as a full employee, and added a second helper, a young man named Robert Chen, whose family had been brought to work the railroads years before, and who had settled in the region with no place that fully claimed him. Robert was good with inventory and better with numbers than almost anyone she had encountered, and she paid him fairly and without regard for the opinions that some townspeople expressed about this, which opinions she addressed with the direct economy she applied to all obstacles. Charles, when he heard about the opinions, said quietly, "Robert Chen does good work, and you pay him fairly, and anyone who wants to take that further can take it further with me." Nobody took it further. Charles himself was changed in ways that were subtle and significant both. He was not a man who changed easily, and she did not try to change him. She simply held a standard in her own conduct and her own speech that was visible and consistent, and he, who paid attention to everything, absorbed it. He was still thorough. He was still formidable. He was still the most powerful figure in the valley, and he held his legal rights and his water claims without apology, because he had built them honestly over years of hard work. But the manner in which he dealt with smaller operators in the valley shifted, in ways that the people who interacted with him noticed, without being able to fully articulate. He was still direct and he still enforced his position, but there was a willingness to hear the other side of things before he moved that had not quite been there before, and there was a readiness to negotiate where before he had simply instructed. His foreman, an older man named Jake Sutton who had been with him since the early years, told Pete Dawson that he figured the missus had something to do with it. Pete Dawson agreed with the wisdom of someone who had witnessed Naomi tell an intoxicated drover to leave her store. In the summer of 1879, a dispute arose over grazing rights with a smaller rancher named Henry Vaught, who had recently bought land on the western edge of the valley and whose cattle kept crossing onto the southern pasture of Thatcher Range. Charles went to speak with Henry Vaught as he would have 5 years before, with papers and certainty. He came back that evening and sat in the library, and Naomi came in and looked at him and said, "Tell me," he told her. She listened without interrupting, which was not the same as listening without opinion, and when he finished she said, "What does Henry Vaught need?" He looked at her. "He needs water access," she said. "He is crossing your land because his own land does not have adequate water in the south section, and his cattle are ranging to find it. His cattle are not damaging your grazing significantly. They are looking for water. That is a different problem than encroachment." Charles was quiet. "If you help him find a water solution," she said, "or grant him a specific limited access arrangement with clear terms, you solve the problem without creating another Tom Briggs situation." He sat with that for a long time. The following week, he rode out to see Henry Vaught again, and this time they came to an arrangement that established a formal, recorded access corridor to a creek at the edge of Thatcher Range's western boundary, with terms that were fair and clear on both sides. Henry Vaught shook Charles's hand with the unrestrained relief of a man who had been bracing for the worst and received something else entirely. Naomi heard about it from Jake Sutton because Charles did not tell her himself, and when she raised it at dinner that evening he said only, "It was the correct solution." "Yes," she said, "it was." And then she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, briefly and without elaboration, which was her version of the extended sentiment. In November of 1879, Naomi told him she was expecting. She told him at breakfast, matter-of-factly and without theatrical staging, because she was not a woman given to theatrical staging, and she said, "I am going to have a baby. I believe it will be in early summer." Charles set down his coffee cup. He looked at her. His expression did the thing it had done in the church, opening like weather clearing, and he said nothing for a long moment, and then he said, "Naomi, with the particular weight of a man who has not been given to hoping for things he was not sure he deserved, and who was currently holding something that had arrived anyway. "You're going to say something sentimental," she said. "I am," he said. "Just give me a moment." She gave him the moment. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it very carefully. "The way you hold something you are still learning is real." "Thank you," he said. She pressed his hand and let him have it. She managed the store through the winter with her customary efficiency. And the spring of 1880 she reduced her hours but did not stop working, because she was not the sort of woman who stopped, and because Sarah Beekman and Robert Chen were capable enough that she could trust them with larger responsibilities. She trained them toward full management with the same methodical patience she had always applied to teaching, and she discovered she was good at it. Luz, at the ranch, took an approach to the pregnancy that involved both significant practical support and a quiet proprietary pride that Naomi found unexpectedly moving. Luz had been at Thatcher Range for 11 years and had seen it grow from a hard-running operation with a half-built house to what it was now, and she had apparently decided long before the wedding that whatever woman Charles Thatcher eventually married would need to be someone who could match him. She had told this to Pete Dawson, who had told it to Jake Sutton, who had told Charles, who had told Naomi with a smile, and Naomi had thought about it and then gone to Luz in the kitchen and said directly and warmly, "I understand you had opinions about my suitability." Luz had looked at her without flinching and said, "I had requirements. You met them." They got along very well after that. The baby came in June of 1880. On a hot morning when the thunder was building in the south, and Charles paced the downstairs of Thatcher Range with the contained desperation of a man who is accustomed to being in control of situations and is not in control of this one. He had ridden for the doctor at dawn, brought him back at a pace that suggested considerable urgency, and then been instructed to wait, which he did badly. Pete Dawson sat with him on the porch and had the wisdom to say very little. The baby was a boy, born healthy and loud at 10 in the morning. Charles was allowed in shortly after, and Naomi, who was tired in a way she had never been tired before and was also more precisely alert than she could remember being, looked at him in the doorway of the bedroom and said, "Come and meet your son." Charles crossed the room and looked at the baby in her arms with an expression that was entirely unguarded, no restraint, no management, just the plain face of a man who is in the presence of something that has rearranged everything. "He is very small," Charles said. "He will not stay that way," Naomi said. Charles looked at her and then back at the baby and sat on the edge of the bed very carefully, and she shifted so he could see better, and he reached out and the baby's hand, that impossible small hand, closed around his finger with the unreasonable strength of new things. Charles said, "God." "Yes," Naomi said. They named him Patrick William Thatcher, Patrick for her father who had led with hope in ways she was beginning to understand more deeply. William for Charles's grandfather, who had apparently been a man of particular integrity that Charles had always respected. Patrick William Thatcher came home to a ranch that had been waiting for him without knowing it, and Luz held him with the authority of a woman who considered herself essential to his upbringing, and Jake Sutton looked at him with the particular expression of old cowboys in the presence of new life, which is something between amazement and tenderness. Pete Dawson held him once briefly, with the absolute terror of a young man who has never held anything so small and so important, and handed him back very quickly. The store became Naomi's again in full capacity by autumn of that year. She had negotiated Sarah Beekman to a full management role, which freed Naomi to work reduced hours with Patrick in a small basket near the counter, an arrangement that scandalized some customers and was accepted by others as simply what Naomi Rourke did, which was manage things on her own terms. Charles came to the store more often than he probably needed to, for a man who ran an operation of 40-plus cowboys and thousands of acres of cattle range. He came for the specific variety of coffee, and for rope, and occasionally for no stated reason that he offered, and Naomi did not press him for one. She simply made the coffee, and they talked, and Patrick slept in his basket or regarded the ceiling of the store with the focused attention of someone encountering a new world. One afternoon in the fall of 1880, Charles came in at midday and found Naomi in a spirited disagreement with a cattle buyer from Wichita who had decided her store's pricing on certain items was negotiable. The cattle buyer was a large man named Fisher, with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the largest presence in a room. Naomi was explaining, without raising her voice but with an absolute precision that was more effective than volume, that the price on the shelf was the price she charged, that she did not negotiate on individual items for individuals, and that if he wanted to do business with her, he would do it on her terms. Fisher was visibly struggling with this, and had apparently been hoping to appeal to some sense of commercial vulnerability that he had incorrectly assumed she possessed. Charles came in and read the situation in about 4 seconds. Fisher looked at him, and the relief on his face suggested he expected Charles Thatcher to constitute an authority that would adjust things in his favor. Charles said, Fisher. Fisher said, Thatcher, maybe you can. No, Charles said. She's right, her prices are fair, pay what she's asking or find another supplier. Fisher looked between them. I'd also, Charles said conversationally, suggest you take that tone somewhere else. This is my wife's store. Fisher bought what he needed at Naomi's price, tipped his hat with strained courtesy and left. Naomi looked at Charles. I had it, she said. I know you had it, he said. I just wanted to be here. She studied him for a moment, and then she said, Thank you. And she meant it fully, and he nodded, and she gave him coffee, and he stayed until Patrick woke up from his basket and demanded attention. The years that followed were the kind of years that accumulate into a life, full of small things that seem simple and are not, and large things that become simple only in retrospect. In 1881, Charles formally established a water-sharing cooperative arrangement with 4 smaller ranchers in the valley, a legal structure that gave them reliable access to secondary water sources on Thatcher Range in exchange for their cooperation during the dry seasons that periodic Kansas weather made certain. It was Naomi's idea in its original form, proposed one evening in the library over 2 cups of coffee, and a disagreement about irrigation that had somehow become a structural proposal for shared resource management. Charles had looked at her across the table with the particular expression she had come to know meant he was not going to say what he was thinking immediately. You could have been a lawyer, he said. I could have been many things, she said. I chose dry goods. You chose Caldwell, he said. I chose, she said, looking at him steadily, rather well, I think. The 4 ranchers who came to the arrangement included a family named Kohler who had come from Germany 2 years prior, and who spoke English haltingly but did very good work, and an older widow named Margaret Hatch who had been running her late husband's cattle on sheer determination for 3 years, and who had been half expecting Charles Thatcher to acquire her land any season now. When the arrangement was offered, Margaret Hatch sat in the Thatcher Range library and looked at the papers and then at Charles and then at Naomi and said, in a voice that was very level, What does this actually cost me? Naomi said. What it says in the document. Nothing more. Margaret Hatch looked at her. You wrote this. I contributed to it. Margaret signed the document with the controlled relief of someone who has been holding against a wall for a long time. She shook Charles's hand, and then she shook Naomi's hand, and the handshake with Naomi lasted slightly longer. Patrick Thatcher grew into a child who combined his mother's directness with his father's thorough quality, which meant he was very certain about things from an early age and required patient and honest engagement rather than management. By the age of 2, he had organized strong opinions about horses, of which there were many at Thatcher Range, and about the large kitchen cat Luz maintained, who was named General and was not organizational material under any circumstance. In late 1882, Naomi was expecting again. This time she told Charles on the porch in the evening, because she had been thinking about how to tell him, and decided that this time she would choose a moment, rather than a meal. He was watching the last of the light go out of the western sky when she came and stood beside him and said, "Patrick is going to have a sibling." Charles turned to look at her. "Early spring," she said, "I believe." He put his arm around her, drawing her against his side, and she let him, leaning into that specific warmth, and they stood looking at the dark prairie under the last edge of light. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am well," she said. "I am better than well." He pressed his lips to her hair, which was partially down at this hour of the evening, and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Patrick will be insufferable about this." She laughed, and the laugh went out into the prairie air, and the night came down around them gently. The second child was a girl, born in March of 1883, on a morning when the first hint of spring was in the air, the same season everything good seemed to happen to them. They named her Clara Margaret Thatcher. Clara for Clara Sims, who had been a neighbor and a nosy and warm-hearted presence in Naomi's Caldwell life from the beginning. Margaret for Margaret Hatch, who had shaken Naomi's hand with that particular grip. Clara arrived with her mother's green eyes and her father's serious expression, and Luz, who held her at the first opportunity, announced in a tone that admitted no disagreement that this child was going to be either a judge or a general, and that either way everyone at Thatcher Range should prepare accordingly. The store expanded in 1883. Naomi had been planning the expansion for 2 years, and when the building adjacent to hers became available, she purchased it with the profit she had carefully accumulated and the precise efficiency she had always applied to her accounts. She knocked through the shared wall and doubled the floor space, added a second counter for the pharmacy and household goods section, and hired a third person, a woman named Dorothy Park, who was recently widowed and sharp, and had come to Naomi asking for work with the directness of someone who expected to be assessed fairly. Naomi assessed her fairly and hired her, and Dorothy proved to be excellent. Charles came to the expanded store on the day it opened, which happened to be in September, and he stood in the center of the new space and looked at what she had built, all of it from the modest inventory and the carefully kept ledger she had started with in 1877, and he looked at her with an expression that had no reserve in it at all. "You are extraordinary," he said. "I am thorough," she said. "You taught me the value of that." "I don't think you learned thoroughness from me," he said. "No," she admitted, "but you showed me it could also be kindness." He crossed the floor of the new store and took her face in his hands, there in the middle of the new Rourke's dry goods with the morning light coming through the new windows, and kissed her, and she kissed him back. And Dorothy Park and Sarah Beekman and Robert Chen found things to organize in the other section of the store with considerable urgency. The valley had changed around them over these years in ways both gradual and sudden. The cattle trade was evolving, the great drives thinning as the rail lines extended, and the open range gave way to fencing. Barbed wire, which had been a novelty when Naomi first arrived in Caldwell, was now standard, changing the entire nature of how ranches were managed and how water and grass were controlled. Charles had been watching these changes with the thoroughness he brought to all practical matters, and had made adjustments to Thatcher Range's operations that kept it well positioned, even as the old open-range cattle economy began its slow transformation. He was sitting in the library one evening in 1884, with the account books for the ranch spread around him, and the particular focused stillness he had when he was working through something complex, and Naomi came in and sat in her chair across the table, Patrick asleep in the house behind them, and Clara having finally surrendered to the same at roughly the same time, and she said, "Tell me what you're thinking." He looked up. He had never had to be invited twice to tell her what he was thinking. It had taken him some months early in their relationship to understand that she was asking genuinely and could hear the answer, and once he had understood that, the telling came with an ease that still surprised him about himself. He told her about the fencing changes, the rail expansion, the shifts in the cattle market, the decisions he was weighing about Thatcher Range's future. She listened with the complete attention she always brought, and then she said, "You have been thinking about diversification." Yes, he said. Wheat, she said. He looked at her. The wheat market, she said. The farming expansion going on in the western counties. The land that you have in the northwest section of the range that you have never fully utilized for cattle because the terrain does not suit it. He had been thinking exactly this. She had arrived at it through her own reading of the economic patterns coming through the store, through the farmers who bought from her, through her own study of the agricultural manual that had been one of her 4 chosen books from Missouri. "How long have you been thinking about this?" he said. "About 18 months, she said. He looked at her across the books. "I wanted to understand it better before I raised it," she said. "I do not like to suggest things I have not thought through." "I know," he said. "I love you." It still arrived with force when he said it directly like that, always had, because he did not say things for effect. He said things because he meant them. "I love you too," she said, "and I think wheat is worth serious consideration." They talked about it until midnight, with the lamp burning low and the planes quiet outside the window, and came to an agreement on a small trial planting the following spring as a test of the Northwest section's capacity. It was the beginning of a diversification that served Thatcher Range well through the agricultural shifts of the following decade. But that was not a thing either of them knew yet. They only knew the conversation, and the lamp, and the quality of working through something difficult with someone who brings their full mind to it. Patrick was 5 in 1885, and had reached the stage of childhood where he required active management of his interactions with the horses, which he believed belonged to him in some fundamental sense that the horses did not entirely share. He had his father's patience, or was learning it, and his mother's absolute certainty, which was less a learning than a fact of his nature, and the combination produced a child who could wait a very long time for a horse to accept him, and who could not be persuaded that this would not eventually succeed. He would eventually be right. One of Charles's best roans allowed Patrick onto her back for the first time on a Sunday in October of 1885, with Charles standing close and Naomi watching from the fence with Clara on her hip. And the look on Patrick's face was something that Naomi kept in some permanent, careful place in her memory. Charles looked over his shoulder at her from where he stood at the horse's head, and their eyes met over the distance of the yard. And what passed between them in that look was not a single thing, but the whole accumulated weight of 7 years of a life they had built by telling each other the truth. Clara Thatcher at 2 years old had her mother's stubborn jaw and her father's gray eyes, which was a combination that Jake Sutton said, not unaffectionately, boded ill for the peace of everyone around her for the next several decades. She had already mastered the particular Rourke skill of meeting your eyes directly when she spoke to you, regardless of height differential, which when you were 2 and the other party was a full-grown cowboy, was especially effective. Luz had been right, judge or general. The valley in 1886 was a different place than it had been in 1878. The open range was fencing in. The great cattle drives were history more than practice. The town of Caldwell was growing and changing, acquiring permanence in the form of new buildings and a school, and a proper church that had replaced the small one where Charles and Naomi had married. The frontier was edging toward something else, something more settled and more complicated, and the people who had come here in the earlier years were navigating that shift in various ways. Charles had navigated it by being thorough and adaptable, and by listening to his wife, which he considered among the best decisions he had ever made. The cooperative water arrangement was working well. The wheat trial had produced results good enough to justify expansion. Thatcher Range was a different kind of operation than it had been 10 years before, not smaller but differently balanced, more like a managed estate and less like a frontier conquest. He was 42. She was 34. They had been married 7 years, and the marriage was not the same thing it had been in the beginning, which was not a loss but an addition. It had become something with full dimensions, height and depth, and the particular quality of a structure that has been properly built. It had been tested by the ordinary things, by tiredness and disagreement and the thousand small frictions of a shared life, and by larger things, by hard seasons and business difficulties, and a terrifying week in 1884 when Patrick had had a fever that had brought both of them to the edge of what they could bear with equanimity. Patrick had recovered fully. He was now 5 and definite about horses, and entirely his two parents' child. There were evenings in the library when Naomi would be reading and Charles would be working, and the lamp would be burning between them and the quiet of the ranch would be outside the window, and she would look up and find him watching her with the look she had first seen in a church on a March morning, open and simple as weather clearing. "What?" she would say. "Nothing," he would say. "Just you." And she would return to her book, and he to his accounts, and the particular rightness of it would settle over the room like the end of a long argument where you realize you have both been right all along. In the summer of 1887, Robert Chen took full management of the Rourke's accounts department and began training in inventory procurement, which Naomi had been working toward for 2 years. She sat down with him in the back of the store and laid out the full accounting system, every notation, every contact, the Wichita freight arrangement that was now in its 9th year, all of it with the completeness she had always brought to the transfer of important information. Robert accepted it with the seriousness it deserved. He had married the previous year, a young woman named Pearl who worked as a seamstress, and they lived in a small house at the edge of Caldwell, and Robert's position at Rourke's Dry Goods had made this possible. Naomi had attended the wedding and brought them a gift she had chosen with care, and she had sat at the celebration dinner and thought about her father Patrick, who had believed in Caldwell because he needed to believe in something, and about the fact that sometimes the belief, even when it comes from desperation, plants something real. She told Charles about this later, and he listened with the attention he always gave her, and then said, "Your father was right to come here." "He was," she said. "He just did not get to see what it became." "He saw enough," Charles said. "He saw you start it." She looked at him for a moment with the directness she had always brought to looking at him, and then she said, "You are much more sentimental than your reputation suggests." "I have a carefully managed reputation," he said. "I know," she said. "I am the only one who knows the difference." "Yes," he said, "and I am grateful for it every single day." There was a morning in September of 1887 when Naomi woke early, before Charles, and lay in the early light of the Thatcher range bedroom, and listened to the sounds of the ranch beginning, the distant activity of the bunkhouse, the horses, the particular quality of a Kansas morning before the day fully arrived. She lay and thought about the 26-year-old woman who had stood on the porch of Rourke's Dry Goods and refused to look away when a feared man rode past, and about everything that had come from that refusal to be less than exactly herself. She had not made it easy on herself or on him. She had not pretended to be simpler than she was or more agreeable than the truth permitted. She had held her lease and her position and her opinions, and he had walked back through the door anyway, again and again, and she had eventually understood that what she had always believed in private, which was that her directness was a virtue rather than a failing, was something he had understood before she had fully named it. Charles stirred beside her and turned toward her, and she was already looking at him when he opened his eyes. "You are thinking very loudly," he said. "I was thinking about a porch," she said. He looked at her with the easy familiarity of a man who knows the other person's references. "The porch in 1878. Yes. What about it?" "I was thinking," she said, "that I have never been sorry, not for one single thing." He looked at her in the morning light for a long, still moment. Then he reached out and put his hand against her face, warm and careful as always, as though he were still in that early season of learning to believe in the reality of it. "Neither have I," he said. Patrick appeared in the doorway behind them at this point, having woken early with the reliable energy of a 7-year-old, who needed to tell his father that he believed the roan mare was going to foal soon, and he needed to be present for it. And the moment dissolved into the practical mourning of a family, which was its own kind of grace. They went out to the barn in the early morning, all of them. Charles with Patrick beside him and Naomi carrying Clara, who had appeared behind Patrick with her gray eyes fully alert. And the mare was indeed in early labor. And they stood together in the warm hay smell of the foaling barn, while the summer light came through the gaps in the boards, and Charles explained what was happening with the quiet precision he brought to showing his children how things worked. Patrick watched everything. Clara watched Charles's face. By mid-morning there was a new foal, shaky-legged and vigorous, and Patrick's expression was the same expression he had worn the first time the roan accepted him onto her back, that particular quality of a person in the presence of something they have been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. Clara reached out and touched the foal's nose with one small finger, very gently, with a gravity beyond her 3 years, and then looked at Naomi with those gray eyes and said, "Ours." "Yes," Naomi said. "Ours." Clara nodded once, as though recording this. Charles caught Naomi's eyes over the heads of their children in the warm, hay-scented morning, and she held his gaze with the same steadiness she had held it on a main street in Caldwell 9 years before, when he had ridden past on a roan horse and the whole town had looked away, and she had not. She had not looked away then. She did not look away now. She smiled at him, fully and without reservation, the smile that was for him alone, the one she had never manufactured or performed. And he smiled back with the openness of a man who had been, in spite of everything, in spite of his reputation and his hard edges and his thorough and relentless management of a world that he had made according to his own terms, genuinely and completely found out by the only woman in the valley who had ever talked back. The most feared rancher in the valley, and the woman who had looked him directly in the eye. They stood in the morning of their life, in the hay and the light, with their children between them and the foal finding its feet, and the Kansas plains going on and on beyond the barn walls, golden and wide, and absolutely theirs. Caldwell would grow and change. The frontier would settle and become something tamer and more documented. Thatcher Range would pass in time through seasons and adjustments and the inevitable turning of decades. Rourke's Dry Goods would become one of the oldest established businesses in the county, the ledger that Naomi had kept from the beginning filled, and then refilled, and then handed on. But in this morning, in this barn, with the foal unsteady in the clean-smelling straw and Patrick describing its features with statistical detail to his father and Clara recording the whole scene in her gray eyes with judicial precision, and Charles Thatcher looking across the width of the space at Naomi, with the expression of a man who has received more than he had allowed himself to plan for. This morning was complete. She had walked into Caldwell in the bitter February of 1877 with a father who led with hope, and a ledger she had already begun to fill, and she had kept her eyes level, and her accounts honest and her lease properly read, and she had not looked away from the man who rode down the street as though the world owed him the ground it was built on, and the world, it turned out, had been entirely willing to offer something better instead. It had offered her this, exactly this, the barn and the morning and the children and the man who had learned, slowly and thoroughly in the way he did everything, that the most powerful thing in the valley had nothing to do with water rights. It had everything to do with the woman on the porch, who had simply refused from the very beginning to be anything less than exactly herself.